computer. Excellent. Hopefully nobody minds. Part of the reason for doing this is I keep forgetting to do that. Okay, so now if Dawn shares, this should all appear again. It's good to practice, isn't it? If everybody who's happy to sort of mutes themselves, or if you're a bit crackly, I'll mute you as it goes along. So don't be offended. We'll just try and keep this one-ended. So Dawn can now see her presentation.
I can. It's not big size. That was my.
Okay.
I don't do that.
Well, there's a play button there, and then there where I pointed. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, Dawn, we are ready for you to lead us off talking about jolly sponges. And I'd save Dawn a lot of pain by saying that this is general interest.
Yes,
so
it's not supposed to be a course or anything.
Yeah, it's not a course, and it's for normal people. And this is really to diffuse Marco's enthusiasm.
Oh God!
I think, because I mean, fantastic to have expertise. Please volunteer extra information if we've stumbled or anything.
Oh, especially if you've seen things that we don't know the names of.
Excellent.
Should it not be full size on yours?
No, I can choose how I see this. Everybody can choose.
Okay, you ready?
Oh yes.
Okay, so first slide is a normal Norfolk sponge community. This is a boulder plain which is just beyond the chalk gullies at Sheringham. And you can see there's a collection of pretty small sort of different sponges all over the boulders, which are mainly flint. And these sponges are particularly keen on the flints. They don't bother with the chalk so much because it's a bit too soft. So it's just a general, here we go into it. And this is really just a chat through the ones we tend to see most often, and a bit of back and forth chat about what's common, what can be mistaken for something else, that kind of thing. Okay, so why are we bothering to look at sponges? Well, I like them, but even if you're not a sponge fiend, they're really handy for finding other things. So this is the end of a mermaid's glove, Heliclona oculata, and you see it's absolutely covered in skeleton shrimps. So if you like doing your macro pictures, this is a great place to go and have a look for tiny animals that use the sponge's currents to collect their own food from the water column. So these are skeleton shrimps, caprella, but also you find harlequin shrimps, which are, I've forgotten it already.
Oh, you have. Oh,
have you forgotten it?
Yeah, I forgot. Oh, the pressure of the thing. We were talking about this only
10
half
minutes
an hour ago.
Yeah.
Harlequin shrimps anyway. Brightly coloured, very variable shrimps.
Very pretty, change colour all the time. Okay, and lots of nudibranchs also live on sponges. I appear to have lost my arrow. I had it just now, now it's gone.
Oh, just use the back of...
Okay.
The...
Okay, so if you're a nudibranch fiend, there are lots that feed particularly on sponges, especially the tiny ones or the ones that are really hard to see. They often are the same colour and shape as the sponges they feed on. So I put up a picture here of one that you can see quite easily. This is just a Cadlina laevis. I don't think it even feeds on this sponge, but it's a good example of the kind of thing to look out for. And he's surrounded by juvenile brittle stars as well, which really stick hard onto sponge.
Lots of animals really like a nice substrate to lock into and lock onto, and it's what makes a turf emerge, having an understory that is stable.
And also, because the sponge is constantly sucking through water, it's a great place to get tiny bits of food if you're a tiny animal, like a baby brittle star. Okay, so the first sponge we're going to look at is the Norfolk purple sponge, Hymodesmia, and it's still stuck at Hymodesmia species at the minute because they haven't come up with a species name for it yet. It's a long process and it costs money and effort, and people don't get round to it very fast.
Yeah, I have talked to a couple of sponge taxonomists, but it needs a bit of, I mean, I was told that the whole of the Hymodesmias really need doing.
We
And
do, yeah.
yeah, and this is the kind of focus that's difficult to get. You say, well, we only really want to name one new sponge, but that it's not the way that it appears. To make sense, they want to rework Hymenedesmia as a
Everything.
whole, and that's an even bigger challenge to raise funds for.
Mm-hmm. So this looks like a really big sponge, but actually it tends to grow as a very thick, rubbery crust over the boulders. It really likes flint, so it completely covers them, but it only seems to grow on them where there's chalk as well. So I think it needs that chemistry in the water. Here's another, a fairly close-up bit of a piece of the Hymenedesmia, and you can see it's also got another sponge called Aplyzilla sulfurea growing in amongst it. That's the bright yellow one, and that's usually easy to pick out, even though it's a piddly little thing. It's only, those patches are only a couple of centimeters long, but they've got those little bright yellow points all over them where they come to little peaks.
Yeah, I volunteered to make a fool of myself,
Good,
but
good.
but what about that blue sponge, Dawn?
Oh, the one between the yellow patches, you idiot.
Yes, that one. Why aren't you mentioning that?
Because that's a squirt. It's a colonial squirt, and squirts and sponge crusts are often mistaken for each other. You can usually work out which they are by giving them a bit of a poke. The squirts are really like soft jelly, whereas the sponges are like sponge for the most part. And also, if you take a good photo, you can have a look later and see what the organization is like. Squirts are very, very regular. They have inhalant and exhalant siphons in very particular places, whereas sponges tend to be very, very random.
Okay, I understand now. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh God, this is becoming a lecture now. It takes a while to jump on, doesn't it? Slightly further away picture of the Hymenedesmia on a boulder. You can see it's very variable. The color tends to vary quite a lot. And here's an Inachus crab wearing a bit of it, and he's also got a bit of boring sponge above him, which we'll come on to later. And here's the advert that appeared, not advert, cartoon that appeared in the local newspaper when we first found the damn thing. If anyone has seen this sponge anywhere else, we'd be quite interested, because I keep asking and nobody's come back with records from the UK yet.
Yeah, people are pretty quiet about purple sponges. I've seen them in another couple of places, including things that are quite like ours. But we do seem to have 4 or 5 local purple variants. So we don't know if it's a chemical thing or whether they're just all blackcurrant flavored. We need science.
Speaking of which, this sponge is purple, and it's not the Hymenedesmia. This is an Oscarella, and we find that local to Norfolk, it grows in this lovely colour when it's in shade and doesn't get very much light at all, generally on chalk overhangs. But the other thing about it is it doesn't have any skeletal structure to it. It doesn't have any spicules, and so it's very, very soft and flobby. So if you just waft your hand near it, it'll wave around like anything. No real structure to it. So this is the colour I like best when it grows in the dark. And this is the colour it goes if it's out in the light. There's a weird, sort of mucusy colour. And we thought these were 2 separate species, but I've seen it growing around a thing, and it's this colour on the top side where it's in the light, and when you turn it over, it's the bright purple on the other side. But Oscarella is really difficult to get to species. There are several, but you can't take the spicules out to have a look at because it hasn't got any. And so we tend to stick at species for this one. And here's yet another purple sponge. This one is Haliclona viscosa. Again, it tends to coat boulders and things, but it can get away and start branching out, or it can be an almost flat crust with almost no features. And this one, if you were to try to snap a bit off, it would snap away cleanly, like bread breaking. A couple more pictures of it. And then there's this one, which can grow in exactly the same way as that, in a variety of branching and flat shapes. But this is Haliclona cineraria. When you try to break this, it'll come away with clear strands of mucus between it and the parent thing, and they're almost elastic. It feels like it wants to pull back again. You happy with that?
Yeah, I mean, weird that this one, the other one is the viscose one, and this one has a cinerary.
I don't make the rules.
Yeah, that's names for you.
Here's an example of it being a bit more sort of roundy and cute and not so veiny.
And we do have seasons with, where the water is turbid. Probably for close to 6 months of the year.
Oh yeah, easily.
So that there's a lot of sediment. So I think some sponges like it, some don't, and some clean and some don't. So you can see some of these are very silty, and others, like this Haloclona, are standing up out of the silt and staying clear.
Yeah, so this is another Haloclona. This is one you might well be familiar with, Haloclona oculata, mermaid's glove. This is a really good one for looking for other animals on. You see there's a painted top shell hiding in the topmost branches. This is another one where the harlequin shrimps hang out. I nearly remembered it then. And the skeleton shrimps again, and also nudibranchs tend to hide around at the base of it.
Hippolyte?
Pardon?
Hippolyte?
That's it, Hippolyte varians. You're too slow.
I was just looking that up so I could feed it to you so you'd sound clever. Excellent. I think it does the audience good to feel it superior.
Yes, definitely.
Thanks very much.
So this is a slightly more stubby one that's grown in a different area of current, and you can see there is a caprella shrimp right on the very top rightish of it. And also it tends to get this red algae growing on it over the winter, and it almost seems to slough that off again come spring. A more big fat chunky one. And here's a very tall spindly one out in the open after the chalk gullies finish. So this was probably 30 centimeters high by about 40.
It's taken with a fisheye lens, so it looks like it's a meter high, but it's a fraction of that. And we don't get many sort of the erect sponges, just because of the pot ropes that sort of scour the top surfaces of everything.
There's an estuary in Suffolk that we go and snorkel, and that has speedboats running through it at high tide, but at low tide they can't get through, so it's safe to snorkel. And the Haloclona there grows as big flat plates because it's been constantly skimmed off at a certain height.
Yeah, it's planed flat. It's amazing it survives, but it's not got a lot of competition from other species that enjoy that.
Okay, so here's another slightly upright sponge, which you might mistake for that. This is chimney sponge, Polymastia penicillus. And so this has a big flat base, which is often covered over with bits of sediment and stuff. And it has these little straight-sided chimneys growing out of it, which are generally very pale, and you can sort of see through them a bit. And this will cover an area, well, it can get massive, but generally they're about 10 or 15 centimeters across. And you might see one or two a season. They're not very common off Norfolk. There's a slightly closer picture. You can see those chimneys. And, oh, that'll be nice and easy to look up. But unfortunately, we also have this one, Spongicalifragilistic penicillus, the tapered chimney sponge. So it's often darker in colour, always grows to points rather than coming straight up. And it's got that weird solid core to it, a bit like a pencil lead or something. This is even rarer off East Anglia, but we have seen it a lot more around the south coast. We have seen it here once or twice.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a thing that you'll get used to, that the forms that appear in localities can be very different from the typical forms shown in reference books.
Yes,
and sometimes they're very similar.
Yes, we will come to some soon that are very different, won't we?
Yeah, so in the UK, the reference books tend to be very heavily biased towards the southwest of England, maybe the west coast of Scotland, because that's where the diving is simpler. in to put no closer point on it, but we'll come into some species that occur in the East in a quite different manner from the textbooks show.
Okay, this is the one that everybody gets taught as soon as they start doing any kind of wildlife diving. This is breadcrumb sponge, Helicondria panacea. It's supposed to smell like bread if you bring it up and sniff it, but I'm not going to do that. It's a very solid sponge, and it has those big oscules on it, the outflow siphons, big round holes. And generally, if it grows along the tops of things, then they are arranged in rows along the top edge. Oh, very good. Look at you with your arty pencil. Especially on the tops of wrecks, they tend to grow like this, like almost like a covering on the handrail. Okay. And you think, oh, that's a nice, easy one to start with. But unfortunately, it often takes on single-celled algae. So if it's out in bright light, it will often be quite a bright green rather than being this color. And it can be a range of other colors in between as well. Much more of a deeper brown sometimes. And then there's this, which is Helicondria bowerbankii, which is closely related. But you see, it's slightly more transparent looking towards the tips. And the easiest way to tell these two apart, if they're not looking very different, is to bend one of those processes around a bit. And the bowerbankii will just bend, whereas the breadcrumb will snap, and you'll feel very guilty.
No. And which we noticed that the other bowerbankii species was also bendy. So we wondered whether Captain Bowerbank just liked bendy things, or whether that was his hobby. He just went around bending animals.
Well, that's disturbing. Right. Okay. This one, goosebump sponge, Dicidia fragilis, very common off Norfolk, but often grows in very small patches. So you tend to pass it by because it's sort of off-white. The patch might only be a couple of centimeters across, and it sort of gets hidden in amongst everything else. So it tends to be under-recorded. It can be anything from this white color to very dark gray and almost purplish sometimes.
And from our shore dives, it tends to occur somewhat deeper.
Yeah, maybe from 4 or 5 meters onwards, it sort of starts to creep in, doesn't it?
Yeah, for you extreme divers, you may not think 4 or 5 meters sounds deeper.
It's a long way out in Norfolk.
It can entail a swim of quite a few hundred meters. So I was thinking more beyond the chalk plain, on the flint plain, you tend to see these, and that can be sort of 7, 8 meters even. We once swam out to 12 meters, and that was a swim of 1 kilometer.
Yep.
So this is typically a very, very shallow sloping coast.
So here's a small example. They are very cute, and a bit like the Aplyzilla, the little yellow one earlier, it comes to points, and that's why it's called goosebump sponge. But this is bigger and more obvious, a lot easier to see than the Aplyzilla.
Yeah, and there's matching nudibranchs that predate sponges that come to points to look like these things.
Oh, this one has its own barnacle, which I forgot to look up. But it lives inside the sponge and just sort of pokes its little openings out, and it makes the sponge look like it's covered in black spots. A further away picture of a bigger example. You see it's almost a crust on things, but it's a very big lumpy one. It's almost like old chicken skin thrown away. Here's a really pointy version. This has probably been picked at by crabs to put on their shells, and it's reacted by becoming more spiky. And here's the other one we get very rarely at the ends of the gullies. This is Dicidia pallescens. It doesn't have a common name here, but it's bright pink, like bubblegum pink, and it's chunkier and much more spiky than the white one. Generally grows in bigger lumps, maybe, what's a foot? 30 centimeters across. Much bigger sponge.
1/3 of a washing machine.
This is pearlescens again. This is not very well, this piece. So you can see it's got white patches. That's not the goosebump. That's this losing its colour. The other difference between this and the goosebump is it tends to have these sort of clear standing up bits around its oscules, which my assistant is not drawing around currently. There's a better one coming up. Now you can see in the middle of that one. Yeah, and there's one to the right of it. Yeah. It tends to have a lot more of these. The goosebump does have clear oscules, but they don't stand up like this. And that's got the purple sponge around it again as well. All right. You're not being very noisy. This is my favourite sponge, Psychonciliatum, the vase sponge. And you can see it is like a tiny little Greek vase. This is, what kind of sponge did you say it was? Because it's not glass, is it?
This is calcareous rather than silicaceous.
So it's got these glassy splinters poking out in a ring round the neck, but they're not actually glass. And those are spicules. So those are vast versions of the things we'll be looking at later to see how you tell sponges apart. And it's a really cute little thing. Only a couple of centimetres high. They tend to sit up on the seaweed in sort of quite tight packed bunches, often with other sponges and mulgular squirts as well. This is an example from Essex, and you can see these are hugely long. These are getting on for 10 centimetres long, absolutely massive in the estuaries down there. We don't know why they grow so differently. It must just be the currents. Everything grows differently in Essex, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's streaming currents. I think I guess probably high nutrient, but low competition water, where they can just grow and grow, but they're sort of drawn out along the ground.
Yeah. Here's another nice little example. A couple of these. You see, they look really furry, and that is the spicules sticking out through their bodies, and they're hollow inside. So you could have a lovely single flower in one. But often there are things living in there, so it's always worth a quick look. I think these are pretty obvious and hard to mistake for anything else, but they have a relative. This is Grantia compressor, which is a similar body plan, but these are a bit flattened. So you're sort of looking at it side on, and it's almost like a leather water bottle or a leather purse, and it's just got the one hole at the tip, which is pointing down, a bit like somebody's back. A bit like the vase sponge, but not with that lovely collar sticking out. And this next one is a bit more obvious. This is an Essex one, so it's been etiolated and drawn out and made more exaggerated. And see, this one's got a couple of holes. It's got one bottom left and one far right. And that's just the way it's been pulled out. They can have any number, but it's normally one. And the weird stuff to the top left that looks like raffia, this is actually another sponge that we'll come on to in a bit. This is Leucoselenia. And in Essex, it grows like this. It looks like empty straws. But everywhere else we've ever been, it's tight little dark, pale grey bunches. And I'll show you in a bit. Okay, Polymastia boletiformis, hedgehog sponge. Everybody loves this one. It's a cute little thing. Looks like Bart Simpson's head from the back or something. This one is only probably 5 centimetres across. It's a perfect little sphere. Most of those spikes are blind-ended, but it has one in the top where it draws in water. Oh, I've actually got a few.
It's got loads of holes.
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking of something else. Anyway, it's covered in big oscules where it draws it. No, that's where it puffs out the water. I'm losing track. Right. It's covered in lots of exhalant oscules. We've only ever seen this once off East Anglia. And we saw this one, which is very, very cute. It was on a very fast drift, which will probably never go on again, which is a shame. And then we saw this one, which was much bigger than a dinner plate. I have never seen this sponge so big. It's like a massive hat having a lie down on the bottom.
Now, Dawn has spoken of this for many, many years. This is, in fact, from 9 years ago when we did a series of drift dives. And this is super deep for us. This is probably around 14 meters.
I'll never see it again. Anyway.
Oh, we'll get you out there, even if we have to build you a submarine.
Anyway, yes, I remember you saying, no, you didn't. I said, yes, I did. Anyway. So this is a good one to look out for. If anyone sees this anywhere off East Anglia, we'd be very excited.
On the whole, we're low on sponges. And one of the reasons we think we're low on sponges is that sort of long-living sort of turf animals are regularly removed by the abrasive fishing. Because during COVID, when fishing intensity dropped, we saw more of the Subarites sponges establishing on the top of gullies. So the fishing really does reduce the biodiversity, and it might be why these are getting big but low further out, where the fishing density is reduced.
True enough. This is Raspalia ramosa, and it's called chocolate finger sponge, and you might wonder why.
Why is that?
Because with us, it grows as chocolate brain sponge. But around most of the rest of the country, it'll grow into a tall thing, like the mermaid's glove. You know, big, thick brown fingers standing out from the bottom. But here, it stays at that sort of height, and it gets completely covered in sediment, so it's really quite hard to pick out.
Yeah, very low lying. Unlike the other areas of the country, we just don't get fingering here.
Anyway, here's an example completely covered in silt. Stop looking at me. And here's one that I've given it a really severe wafting, and you can see it's still clinging onto its silt. It's a rich dark brown under all that, but it's almost impossible to see.
The form is so different from the textbook form that this was confirmed by spicule analysis, because there was no obvious visual way to draw a conclusion from one typical identity to this species. So we were lucky enough to have a sponge person. They took some spicule samples, and lo and behold, this was fingers where no fingers were.
Yes. And here's the fingeriest one we've ever seen. You see, it's barely knuckles. That takes a long time to change over. Okay, so this one, Halisarca dujardinii, again, a very similar shape to that last one, but much paler colour. Up in Norfolk, it always looks like this, an off-white colour, again, a bit brainy, and sort of wriggles around on the top of chalk and boulders. Down in Essex, it's bright yellow. We don't know why. Maybe it's another species and nobody's noticed yet, like everything else. But this is another very soft sponge, so if you waft over it, it tends to wave around a bit.
Yeah, and changes could be the subject of chemical imbalance, outwash from agricultural land or human settlements. All kinds of evil stuff can happen.
Especially in Essex estuaries.
Yeah, like sort of seeing the articles about the huge die-off of crustaceans around Yorkshire. It was from dredging, where poisons had been in the river and were freed by dredging, which the fishing authorities kept very quiet about, as though they have no interest.
Funnily enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Subarites, I am now sticking at species because the descriptions for the two species which should be found locally have started to overlap horribly. So there's this one, and then there's this one, which we tend to see this one deeper, whereas this one is often up shallow. And I would have previously said that this one was Subarites carnosus, and that one Subarites ficus. But according to Bernard, you can't really tell them apart just by looking at them now. So I'm sticking at Subarites for these.
Bernard is both a powerful influence, Bernard Picton is both a powerful influence for sort of taxonomic science and a malign influence on recording, because he's always sort of holding open the possibility that you don't know what you're looking at. which is very true. But when you want to record, the lack of the good collateral information to go to an identity can make your records appear less valuable. So as recorders, we try and sort of fight back on that. Ooh, how exciting. We try to fight back on that to make sure that the records maintain their maximum value without sort of unnecessary vagueness.
Okay, so this is the Leucoselenia I was talking about earlier, the stuff that was all weird and hairy in Essex. Up in Norfolk, it tends to exist as tiny little pom-poms, maybe 1 or 2 centimeters across. And it's an off-white color, and it's often amongst other turf on substrate that's the same color as it. So it's very hard to get your eye in for. So Rob is just describing it as being 2 centimeters across so that he has a part to play.
Look at me, I'm useful.
So that's Norfolk, and this one again is Essex. And this stuff is probably 15, 20 centimeters across and incredibly soft and wafty. And it took us ages to work out what on earth it was because it's so different.
Very strange, no core and extensively growing along. The similar kind of habitat to have those long Grantia compressor purse sponges.
And then we have this one, the boring sponge.
Oh, don't do it down. You can make it live for us.
This is actually my favourite sponge. It's like a little fairy. Okay. In East Anglia, this grows out of the chalk, and all you see are its various siphons. So you've got your exhalant siphons, the big round holes, and inhalant siphons, which have a pore sieve over them. So they look like little yellow flowers. And that's because the sponges don't want to be drawing big lumps of stuff in when they pull the water through. And so they have a covering over to stop anything too big going down. But their exhalant things can be as big as they like because they're just blowing out. And Cleona used to be thought to be just one species in the UK, Cleona salata, that grew in lots of different ways depending on where it was. So over here, it would grow as just these tiny little circles coming out of the chalk. But somewhere like the southwest, you'd get a massive lump of bright yellow cheese with these dotting the surface that just stood out for about 30 centimeters high out of the side of a reef. But they've now decided that there's probably 3 or 4 species of it. And so we all have to stick at Cleona sp until somebody decides what's what.
So asking, or mentioning to Will, we talked about DNA. This is the kind of thing you might approach with DNA, because it's understood now to be a complex of species. That might be true. And it would help the process of identification to be able to sort of to say whether you could or could not visually identify these species.
Yep. I think we're nearly there. Right, here's the pore sieves closer up, and you can see the surface completely covers the hole to stop anything lumpy getting in. And if you find a piece of chalk that's had this in it, it's just got a complete maze of branching tunnels through it. It's pretty impressive. Oh, I've forgotten this. Shredded carrot sponge, Amphilectus fucorum. This was one of the first ones we ever learnt, and we were told it was the only bright orange sponge there was. This is a lie. I feel cheated. A particularly bright orange. It always has this very open texture. It's full of holes, looks really spongy. But it can be pretty flat like this as a standing up crust. It can be quite tassely like this. Or it can be absolutely mental like this. And if you're in Scotland and you dive deep, it loses its colour at depth. And so it can look like this and be white. And it's still shredded carrot. And I'm very resentful that anyone ever told me that it was a bright orange thing that always looked like this. And nothing else does. And here's a thick crust of it with a friend in blue, which appears to be structurally the same sponge, but in a bluey green colour. And if anyone's ever seen this anywhere else and knows what it is, I'd be very interested. We see this on the deeper flints again, with the shredded carrot and with a bright yellow version as well. And we don't know what that is either, but they all grow as these intermingled crusts. And we have asked Bernard and we have asked Claire, and neither of them had any idea what it might be, which was irritating.
Yes, Bernard Picton and Claire Goodwin are good on sponges. Claire especially, she's been very helpful for us, but unfortunately funding for her museum post died off, so she's over in Canada looking at much bigger animals now.
Much bigger sponges. Closer view of the blue one, and it's got a little patch of the bright yellow in the middle as well. Even closer view, you see it's got quite a good structure to it. But this is one we've never had a name for, and whenever I go out to take spicules, I never find it. And when I don't take the bag, I find loads. This one turns up in the very shallows, probably, it's definitely within snorkeling depths. It's probably 0.5 metre to 1 metre deep, and it's massive. It can be 1 metre across, covering several boulders and holding them together. I cannot say it. We have tried. It's something like Hymenea per levis.
I think that's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. The confusing thing is we also have something very similar, which we mostly only see down in Essex, called Subrites massa, which also looks like a big brain, but tends to be yellow and a bit smoother looking, less bobbly. And again, this thing, this sponge only looks like this here, where I've seen it in other places. It looks very different indeed. It's usually little individual pointy bits poking out of the surface of rocks, or a very thin skin that's a much deeper red colour. But this is one that would be good for snorkelers to look for, because it always seems to be very shallow. And lastly, here's a nice picture of some sponge spicules. These are what you'd get out. It's a completely another talk to talk about doing this, but basically you dissolve the sponge tissue with bleach, and these are left behind. If it's a sponge that has these spicules in, you'll get a range of these needles, which are different lengths and widths and have bobbles on the end and things like that. And you can use a chart to see what measurements they should have under a microscope. And then you also have these, which are a range of stars and spheres and things in different species, which can be quite a quick, easy way to pick out what you've got if you haven't got time to spend hours measuring all the needles and things.
Well, the different species have different stuff in.
Yes.
Some have extremely dull selections of needles, which are just slightly different lengths. And some have very characteristic presence of a variety. The mix can be characteristic, or can have very impressive and distinctive stars, anchors, and so on, which can be a dead giveaway from the off. This was a Christmas card from Claire Goodwin, and as it turned out, it was quite wrinkly, which is why the picture's a bit wrinkly, but in a fantastic field of study, and sort of a properly rewarding thing to look at. It's not just squashing stuff. Excellent. So you're done.
I'm done.
Excellent. Well, your
20-minute
talk has only lasted 40 minutes.
Oh, that's good by our standards.
Which is excellent.
I've stopped sharing.